Old Testament lesson 29. He took up the mantle of Elijah. Before we jump into the story of Elijah, a little bit of history, going back to a lesson that we had towards the end of last year on the death of Joseph Smith and how the next president of the church was selected. So there was a bit of a succession crisis in Nauvoo. Sidney Rigdon, who had left Nauvoo because he was at the time, Joseph Smith's vice presidential candidate, as Joseph Smith was running for president. President, vice president can't be from the same state, so Sidney Rigdon had moved. He came back to Nauvoo, said that he should be the guardian of the church until Joseph Smith's son was old enough to take the reins. Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, it had been reported, had heard, whatever, that Joseph Smith had said a couple months prior, I think, that if anything were to happen to him and Hiram, that Samuel would be the next one to lead the church. But Samuel died under mysterious circumstances about a month after Joseph Smith did. James Strang, a relatively recent convert, but had been sent by Joseph Smith up to Wisconsin to establish a stake of the church up there. He came, said that at the moment Joseph Smith was killed, he had a vision with angels and that he was supposed to lead the church, and had some other great claims over the years of finding plates, translating them, etc. Lyman White had been in Texas in case things went so far south in the United States that the Mormons couldn't be there anymore. Texas at the time was its own nation, so to speak, if you want to call it that. And so Lyman White had said that, or came back and said, Joseph Smith's plan was for us to all move to Texas. Let's go. It's not safe here. Obviously, Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, had a pretty substantial group of people who said that he should be the next one, including Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, as I said, just said that he was going to be the guardian of the church until Joseph's son was available. And then Brigham Young. Brigham Young said that the Quorum of the 12 should be the guardian of the church until Joseph Smith's son was old enough to take over that role. Now, if we look at Nauvoo at this period of time, there's a lot of people coming and going, a lot of immigrants coming in. Nobody really knows for sure how big Nauvoo was, but it's estimated it was approximately 25,000 people. And if we look at this succession crisis, we see that roughly 1,000 of those went with Sidney Rigdon. We got about 3,000 going with James Strang. We got about 5,000 who are saying, we're going to wait for Joseph Smith III to get old enough. We got about 7,000 people who are just like, I'm out of here. There's obviously this is falling apart. They either go to Texas with Lyman Wright, they go back to their old faith, but at any rate, they're gone, they're leaving, and then the remainder over time follow Brigham Young out west. So really, only 2 out of 5 people in Nauvoo ended up following Brigham Young to the Rocky Mountains. And if we look at the timeline here, the church was founded in 1830. Joseph Smith was martyred in 1844, and that's when the succession crisis starts, right? We have a lot of people, I don't know if jockeying for position is the right way to say it, but we have a lot of people claiming that they are the legitimate successors and that people should follow them, that the church, the gospel is going to continue through them. And Brigham Young is one of those main ones. He ends up, taking a lot of people out west to Salt Lake. He comes back and then meets with Wilford Woodruff in winter quarters, and that's when the ball starts rolling to where, over time, like I said, initially he said the Quorum of the 12 should lead the church until Joseph Smith III is old enough, but after a few years that changed, and so we have about 3.5 years from when Joseph Smith was martyred to when Brigham Young was sustained as the next president of the church. Brigham Young was in that role for 30 years, and then when he died, we see another about 3.25 years until John Taylor is sustained as president of the church. When John Taylor dies 7 years later, we see about almost 2 years before Wilford Woodruff is called as president of the church. Now these gaps in time seem compressed, as you look back through history and as you read the history of the church, and you don't realize how long they actually are. And there's some fascinating things. I mean, each time that there's this gap, there's some fascinating things that happen. And if you've never heard of that or studied those time periods, those gaps between presidents, it's worth reading up on. It's really interesting. But after Wilford Woodruff died in 1898, it was a mere 11 days between the time that he died and Lorenzo Snow was put in as the next president of the church. And since then, it's been around a week every time. So the succession of presidents, the first 3 times, was somewhat chaotic, but then after that it's been fairly routine. And we just experienced that just a few months ago. President Monson passed away and President Nelson was called. Elder Gary E. Stevenson explained in a January issue of the Church News the current process of calling a new prophet. He said, when the president of the church passes away, the first presidency is dissolved, and the mantle of leadership goes to the senior apostle and to the quorum of the 12 as a body. So in effect, the quorum of the 12 apostles becomes the first presidency until a formal reorganization takes place. He says the period of time between the death of a standing prophet and the reorganization of the first presidency is referred to as an apostolic interregnum. Oh, not sure what happened there. In order not to delay mission calls or other important business, when the first presidency is dissolved, mission calls continue to be sent out, but now they're sent on Quorum of the 12 letterhead under the signature of President Russell M. Nelson, who's president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. So when a prophet dies, there's no mystery about who is next to be called to serve in that capacity. There's no electioneering or campaigning. If you'll remember, it's been, probably 20 years ago now, President Hinckley was on, I think it was 60 Minutes. He did a number of interviews, but I think it was 60 Minutes where he was asked how you become the next president of the church. And his answer basically was, you just make it into the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and then you outlive everybody else. And that's right. I mean, there's no electioneering, there's no campaigning, there's none of this chaos that we saw in Nauvoo. None of that's going on. You just, as President Hinckley said, get into the Quorum of the 12, outlive everybody else. So he goes on to explain or talk about the actual mechanics of how it happened. And he says, in a January meeting, seated by seniority in a semicircle of 13 chairs, hands were raised to first sustain the organization of a first presidency, and then to sustain President Russell Marion Nelson as the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Quorum of the 12 then gathered in a circle and placed their hands upon the head of President Nelson to ordain and set him apart, with the next most senior apostle acting as voice. President Nelson then named his counselors, the president of the Quorum of the 12, and the acting president of the 12. Following similar sustaining votes, President Dallin H. Oaks, Henry B. Eyring, and M. Russell Ballard were each set apart to their respective offices by President Nelson. So a little bit different there than what we're going to talk about today. I mean, you look at Nauvoo, it's pretty chaotic, kind of crazy. You look at today, it's very mechanical, it's very, organized. And today we're talking about Elijah and Elisha. This picture is a little inaccurate. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but it kind of shows the dramatic succession process that happened here. Now, I don't want to make it seem like this is common, because it's certainly not, but I just wanted to highlight, it can be pretty chaotic like it was in Nauvoo. It can be very organized like it was earlier this year, or it can be glorious like it was with Elijah and Elisha. But before we get into that, frequently as I'm preparing these lessons and I'm reading the manual, there's something in the manual that gives me pause for thought, things that just make you stop and go, And this time, when you read in the manual, it states that in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, Elisha succeeds Elijah as the prophet. Now, I read that, and I had to stop and think about it a little bit. This kind of language assumes that there is only one prophet, and he is the prophet. But the Bible, the Book of Mormon, even LDS history are slightly at odds with that assumption. The church is structured today. The president of the church is often referred to as the prophet, meaning the current president of the church. In my home branch today, it was fast and testimony meeting, and there were many people who referred to the prophet, speaking of President Nelson. Now, it's interesting because this usage represents a shift in terminology. For most of LDS history, when somebody said the prophet, they were referring not to the current president of the church, but to Joseph Smith. There was the prophet, who was Joseph Smith, and then there was President Woodruff, President Smith, President whoever it happened to be. But the prophet was something that usually meant Joseph Smith. Now, that has changed. That's not the way it is today, and it's mainly because of this man, David O. McKay. In 1951, David O. McKay became president of the church. Now, David O. McKay frequently wore a white suit or a light-colored suit. He had a white shock of hair. He had a very magnetic and charismatic personality, and he really looked and acted the role of what people thought a prophet would be like, to the extent that even non-LDS people who had no idea any of this wanted to know, who is that guy? Like, what does he do? Who is that guy, right? So in 1951, he became president of the church. It was just a few short years later where people started referring to him as the prophet. And by his death nearly 20 years later, the tradition had shifted, and the prophet in our vernacular now came to mean whoever occupied the office of president instead of Joseph Smith. Now, we sustain all of the members of the Quorum of the 12, First Presidency, we sustain them all as prophets, seers, and revelators. But now, mainly because of David O. McKay, there's some other things going on here that we're not going to get into, but when people say the prophet, they're referring to the president of the church. Now, equating prophet with president of the church can lead to some confusion and presentism when reading the scriptures. Now, presentism is when you take the present, your current culture, your current ideals, understandings, all of that, and you use it as a filter when you look into the past or when you read the scriptures. So now when we say the prophet and we're referring to the president of the church, who's the head of this big, huge organizational structure, if we try to use that and apply that when we look into the scriptures, we can run into a few problems. It's not the same in the Bible and the Book of Mormon. There are often multiple prophets simultaneously, and many times those prophets are not even involved with any religious organization at all. They're not sitting at the top of a big worldwide organization. Sometimes they're not even don't even have any followers in the scriptures. A prophet could be a lone person who is viewed very poorly by those people he's around. So if we take our current understanding of the term the prophet to mean not only like a teacher and all of that, but also the head of this huge global organization, it can really cause us to misunderstand some of the nuances of what's going on back there. Now, at the time, there were lots of prophets in Israel. Samuel had set up schools of the prophets. We talked a few weeks ago how the Israelites wanted a king. And Samuel said, no, don't. And they said, no, we got to have a king. All our neighbors have kings. They're all kingdoms. We need a king. So Samuel gave them a king, Saul. But at the same time, he knew that having a king would lead down a bad path. And so he established schools of the prophets. Now, Joseph F. Smith, I think it was, gave a fascinating talk on these schools of the prophets, saying they weren't Levites and they had Melchizedek priesthood and whatever else. I'll leave it to you to go find that. But in 1 Samuel 10, when Saul is appointed king, this is the first time we hear the mention of sons of the prophets. And that's what this is. This is these prophetic schools or guilds. But these had declined in Israel's apostasy. Saul went to David, went to Solomon, went to divided kingdom, right? Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and we go on like that, and um, things really kind of started going downhill. And so these schools of the prophets had declined. But Elijah, as he, comes onto the scene, one of the things that he does is he reestablishes them, and he builds them up and makes them, gets them more in line with what they're supposed to be. And so while Elijah was a loner, he was one of those lone prophets, didn't come from the schools of the prophets, Elisha was associated with one of these prophetic groups, one of these schools, if you will. So now with that background, we pick up on the story kind of where we left off last week. Elijah is hiding in the cave. He's just, wiped out 850 false prophets from pagan gods. And Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, is not super thrilled with him. So he's hiding in a cave. Now, while he's there, the Lord tells Elijah to leave his hiding place, return to the north, and anoint Elisha to be his successor. When he gets there, Elisha is in the field plowing with a team of oxen. Elijah walks up to him. Scriptures don't indicate that he says anything at all. Puts his mantle on Elisha and starts walking away, right? And so very symbolic. I'm not sure what that mantle is. Some people say it was like a cloak. Some say like a coat. Some say like a shawl. I don't really know. Some piece of clothing that he was wearing. Very symbolic for him to take that off, because that everybody knew that Elijah, his mantle was, indicative of him being like the chief prophet or the head prophet or whatever. And so putting that on Elisha was very symbolic. And so Elisha, when that happens, he kills the oxen, burns the plow to cook the meat, then goes to follow Elijah. Now it's interesting here, just like we read about Roman generals and many others who would burn bridges so that their armies can return. Cortez burned his ships to send a clear message, there's no going back. Elisha here is taking his tools, taking his livelihood, and he breaks up the plow and he burns it and he kills the ox and he boils the meat and he gives it to his friends. There's nothing for him to go back to. He recognized the significance and the opportunity that Elijah was giving him and the Lord was giving him when Elijah put the mantle on there. And he didn't want to be tempted, I assume, by knowing that at any time, no matter how hard it got with Elijah, I could go back, my oxen's there, my plow's there. He just eliminated that opportunity altogether. And he stops what he's doing and he follows Elijah. Now, he wasn't necessarily well off. Elijah was somewhat of a wonder. We picked up the story. He was living in a cave, and Elisha became his servant. He poured his water, washed his feet, and endured all the same hardships Elijah did. And we don't really know how long that happened, how long after he burns his plow and kills his ox, that he becomes the successor. This story kind of ends, but it could have been a long time. But at any rate, as Elijah's time was ending, the local company of the prophets came out and told Elisha that his master was about to be taken from him. Now, Elisha was Elijah's servant and followed him around pretty much everywhere he went. But there was also the prophets from the school of the prophets would also, they all recognized who Elijah was, and they were somewhat frequent purveyors of the story as well. They were in there. They were following him around to a point as well. And so, they apparently knew that Elijah's time was coming to an end, and were telling Elisha, hey, your master about to be taken. And he says, I know. And so Elijah tells Elisha 3 times, stay behind, stay here. Elisha's like, no way. I'm sticking with you. I don't know how much time, I have left with you and whatever. So as they're walking, Elijah takes his mantle, hits the Jordan River, it parts, they walk across on dry land. And then once they get to the other side, Elisha ascends into heaven. His mantle falls to the ground behind him. Elisha picks it up, and he gains his master's power of miracle and prophecy. Now, this picture I like. A lot of times that you hear this story told or see pictures of this story, you see Elijah riding up into heaven on this flaming chariot. But that's not what the text says. When you read the text, it sounds more like the flaming chariot was there to block Elisha from continuing to follow. Remember, Elijah had already told Elisha 3 times to stay behind, and he said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm staying right with you. And so now a flaming chariot blocks Elisha from following Elijah, and a whirlwind takes him up into heaven. And his mantle blows off in the whirlwind, I assume, and falls on the ground. Elisha picks it up and uses it to part the Jordan River to walk back across just the way he came. And this is when the company of the prophets, they were all there, recognized, okay, Elisha is going to be Elijah's successor. But the company of the prophets did not want to accept the fact that Elijah might be gone. So they kept hounding Elisha, saying, maybe God took him up in that whirlwind and then, set him down on a mountain somewhere. Let's go look for him. Let's go see if we can find him. He might be hiding in a cave again. Elisha keeps telling him no, but they persist, and finally he says, sure, go look, do whatever. It takes them 3 days. They finally come back and say he's not there, and Elisha says, I told you so. Now, interesting the differences here. These prophets, they missed Elijah. They were looking into the past. They remembered what it was like with Elijah. They saw Elisha now have the mantle. I mean, the mantle was put on Elisha when Elijah first came out of the cave, but they saw that, but they're still looking. They're afraid of change. They don't want change. They want Elijah to still be there. Very different from what Elisha did when the mantle was put on his soldiers, right? He broke up his plow, killed his ox, and moved forward into the future. He wasn't stuck in the past like these prophets were. So another thing to mention is before Elijah left, Elisha asked for a double portion of his spirit. Now, in this culture, in this time period, double portion was what the first son got of inheritance. So if a father had 2 sons, when he died, the property was broken up into 3 equal sections. The oldest son got 2, the youngest son got 1. The oldest son always got a double portion of the inheritance of the father that all the other sons got. So when Elijah is going up into heaven and Elisha says, I want a double portion of your spirit, remember, Elisha was part of the school of the prophets that Elijah had reinvigorated and kind of reset back up. And these other prophets, they were following along too. So Elisha, recognizing that he's given up everything to follow Elijah, and now Elijah is about to be taken, asked for a double portion of the spirit, meaning, when you leave and your spirit rests on the school of the prophets, can I have a double portion? And the mantle falling on him was probably a part of that. And so Elisha goes on to become the head prophet, or as the manual says, the prophet. So if we look at Elijah versus Elisha, there's a couple differences here. Elijah focused more on standing up for the God of Israel against popular pagan gods, and he was dedicated to maintaining the presence of God among the people. And because of that, he lived a fairly lonely life. He was bucking the political and social trends of his time. But he's also been called the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. And he's, frequent references to him in the New Testament, in Scripture, and in prophecy, and all kinds of things. Elijah really is quite the figure in the gospel. Elisha, on the other hand, he focused on dramatic miracles and engagement with the political and social life of the nation. Did some amazing miracles. He was a popular and politically connected prophet and kind of a man of the people, but he focused less on maintaining the worship of God and more on injecting God's will into the social and political activities of Israel. Right? Elijah was really trying to get the people to recognize God and keep the presence of God among the people. Whereas Elisha, I don't want to say he'd given up on the people, but maybe recognized that they were pretty far gone, and if he could just keep the God's will in to the social and political activities of the entire nation, they he might have a little bit more success. Now, most of Elijah's prophetic career took place during the reign of King Ahab, who had the wife Jezebel. And in 1 Kings we read, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Right? But Elisha's long career, though it began during Ahab's reign, it extended over 50 years through the reigns of 5 of Ahab's successors to the throne. And these were decades of gradual decline in glory and power for the divided kingdoms in Judah and Israel. The enemies from without, enemies from within, slowly whittled away on their prestige, their influence, their power, their land, their treasure, and eventually they cease to be a nation altogether from their increasing decline and their apostasy. So that's the political climate there and what's going on. Now, in the manual, there's a couple of these miracles that Elisha did. Like I said, Elisha did lots and lots. We could fill multiple lessons with Elisha by himself, but there's a couple of miracles that he performs that the manual pulls out and wants us to focus on. The first one is Naaman, which probably many of us are familiar with. Naaman was a general in the Syrian army. The Syrians had been kind of an on-again, off-again enemy of the Israelites for a long time. Frequent battles with them. And it's believed that he was second to the king. Popular, well-known, well-liked, successful in military campaigns, very wealthy, just a real well-known figure in Syria at the time. But he gets leprosy, and nobody in Syria can help him out. He's tried everything, and nobody can help out. But during a battle at some point, some Israelites were captured and taken back to Syria, and a girl, believed to be a young girl, was being used as a servant for Naaman's wife. And she says something along the lines of, "Too bad we're not back in Israel, because there's a prophet back there in my home country that could heal him." Naaman's wife hears that, tells Naaman. Naaman goes to the king and says, "Hey, I hear there's a prophet in Israel that can heal me." So the king writes a letter to the king of Israel, gives it to Naaman, says, "Go to Israel, take this letter, and tell him, you want to meet that prophet." So Naaman goes there, delivers the letter to the king of Israel. He kind of freaks out. He thinks this is some sort of ploy to, end up back at war, rinse his clothes. Elisha hears about this and calls out to the king, or reaches out to the king and says, "Send him to me, and I'll take care of this." So that's what happens. And when Naaman arrives, a servant of Elisha comes out, says, "Go wash 7 times in the Jordan." Now, you have to imagine Naaman had a big procession of people. He brought lots of wealth, so you can imagine he probably brought soldiers as well to protect that, and then the servants, and then the cooks, and everybody else. Huge procession. He'd been trying for a while to get healed by many different pagan prophets, pagan gods, whatever, in his hometown, and probably whatever else. And so who knows the ceremonies that he would have seen around the healing, but also the pomp and circumstance just from him visiting because of his royal status, right? And so he gets to Elisha's house, and there's nothing. Some servant comes out and says, "Hey, my master says go wash." And Naaman is incensed. He's used to being treated much better than that. And the Jordan River is kind of muddy, kind of shallow. They've got, raging rivers where he's from. He's like, if I was just going to wash, I could have washed back home. But his servants convince him to do what he was told. he washes in the Jordan River, and he's clean. Um, in my mind, the hero of this story, there's a couple different heroes, but the hero is that Israelite girl. Because without her, I mean, Naaman would have been lost in history, right? We wouldn't even know his name. But because of her, because she stood up and said, well, we got a prophet back in my home country. She's a slave for a foreign military leader's wife, taken during battle in a country not her own, and she has no problem standing up and saying, "Oh, there's a prophet back in my home country." And because of that, we get this story, we get this miracle, we hear all of this. The next one the manual wants us to talk about is the chariots of fire. So fast forward a little bit, Elisha has been giving the king of Israel all of Syria's military secrets. They set up an ambush over here. Elisha tells the king, don't send any soldiers that way. They go get ready to attack this city over here. Elisha tells the king, you better fortify that city. So Syria is just getting stopped every step of the way. They can't make any inroads into Israel because the Israelites are always one step ahead. The king of Syria starts getting upset. He thinks he's got a mole. He goes on a mole hunt, and people start telling him, look, you don't have a mole. They got a prophet over there in Israel that's giving the king all of this information. So he says, okay, tell me where he is. They figure out where Elisha is, and he sends his best, right? He sends an army to kill Elisha, and it's his chariots. These are probably like, I don't know, the Navy SEAL guys, right? They're hardened, experienced warriors in chariots with war horses. They're all trained for battle, and they're there to kill Elisha, or at least capture him. And so you could imagine in Dothan, the city where they're at, there's probably a little bit of apprehension, concern. And just like Elijah had Elisha as a servant or an apprentice, Elisha also has an apprentice. And he says, what are we going to do? And it's classic. It's one of the best lines in all of Scripture. Elisha says, don't be afraid. Those that are with us are more than those that are with them. And his apprentice is like, what are you talking about? And Elisha prays. His servant's eyes are open, and he sees the chariots of fire. Interesting, because Elisha, as he's feeling a little apprehensive and concerned about Elijah leaving and asking for a double portion of the Spirit, Elijah says, well, if you see me ascend, then you'll get that. And what does he see? He sees a chariot of fire. And here we have Elisha's apprentice, concerned, apprehensive about what's going on. Elisha prays, and what does the apprentice see? Chariots of fire. And so they obviously are not quite so concerned now that they have chariots of fire. And then Elisha, he prayed for his apprentice's eyes to be opened, but then he prays for the Syrian military, for their eyes to be closed. Now, a lot of people have said this is blindness. It may very well could have been blindness, but I think of the story in Luke chapter 4 where there's a crowd about to throw Jesus off the cliff, and all of a sudden they don't recognize him anymore. They're not blind, but they just don't recognize him, and he walks right through the crowd, walks out, and goes to safety. I have to believe that something similar happened here. These guys all of a sudden just didn't realize where they were at or who he was or what was going on, because Elisha walks out and he says, oh, no, you guys, you're at the wrong city. Follow me and we'll go. Now, if they were actually blind, it'd be near impossible for all of these horses and chariots to follow whatever. But, I mean, if they weren't, if they just didn't recognize what was going on, that makes more sense. So anyways, Elisha takes them to Samaria, which is the capital city at the time, gets them right into the middle of Samaria. They're surrounded by the Israelite army, and then prays for their eyes to be opened. And then the king of Israel wants to kill them all, but Elisha says, no, just as if they were prisoners of war, you wouldn't kill them. Just feed them and send them home. So it's interesting here, the sight, right? Elisha prays for his servant's eyes to be opened. He prays for blindness to fall upon the Syrians, and then he prays for their eyes to be opened when they're inside the capital. A lot of parallels can be drawn there with the gospel, right? they were blind to the gospel, and so Elisha prayed that they would kind of forget all of that and then open their eyes to the true God. We can draw some parallels there. I'm sure you can as well. But there's the question is in these stories, what's the lessons for us, right? Well, some of the lessons for us, we need to be bold like the Israelite girl. It doesn't matter if we're captured during battle, if we're surrounded by the enemy in a foreign land working as a slave. Are we going to doubt and say, well, if that prophet really was a prophet, I wouldn't have been captured in this battle, I wouldn't be in this predicament? Or are we going to stay true to our convictions and say, well, back in my home country, there's a prophet that could handle this, take care of you? We need to be bold like that Israelite girl. But we shouldn't look beyond the mark. Like Naaman, we were talking about pomp and circumstance. He's this great military leader, this well-respected guy, supposedly second in line, or just right underneath the king. As far as authority goes, he's used to people rolling out the red carpet when he comes into town, and he's expecting some big, ornate, maybe healing ceremony. Who knows what types of healing ceremonies the pagan prophets had gone through trying to heal him. So he's expecting something big, something grandiose. And when it doesn't come, he's incensed. He's like, well, I gotta, I'm out of here. There's better rivers in Syria I can go bathe in. But his servants, they say, well, why don't you just do it? Just do what the prophet says, right? They're not looking for something grandiose. They're more practical. They say, hey, we came all this way. Just do what the prophet says. They're not looking beyond the mark. We can learn a lot from those servants. And then he does it. He could have, I assume, he could have done anything to these servants who second-guessed him, right? But he humbles himself. He says, okay, I'll do what the prophet says. There's a lot to learn from both of those parties. We need to be believing like Elisha's apprentice, right? We're right there with the prophet. Might be a little concerned, but just like Elisha believed and saw the chariot of fire and saw Elijah go up in a whirlwind, Elisha's apprentice believed, and his eyes were open and he saw the chariots of fire. We need to be right there on the edge so that the Lord can open our eyes and show us things. We need to be confident like Elisha. He walked right out. He knew that the blindness had fallen on them or whatever, and he walked right out and said, no, you're in the wrong town. Let's go. It's over here. We need to be like him. We need to be dutiful like the king of Israel. When Elisha sent word to the king of Israel and said, send Naaman to me, he did it, right? He didn't question it. Obviously, he didn't want Naaman there anyways, but at any rate, we can learn from that. We can, and then we need to open our eyes to the true gospel. There was a lot going on here about seeing, right? Elisha saw the chariots of fire when Elijah was taken up into heaven. He prayed that the eyes of his apprentice would be opened. He prayed for blindness on the Syrian army, but then prayed for their eyes to be opened as well. And so as we think about this, we need to think about all the different ways that the Lord gets us information, gets us the gospel, and we need to make sure our eyes are open and we're ready to receive it. Thank you.